Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP U.S. History. As today, we talk about how the United States, and indeed the world, experienced an industrial revolution, a transportation revolution, indeed an entire market revolution in the late 17 and certainly the 1800s. Now, the American Revolution did not just bring the United States political independence from Great Britain, but also offered the chance for economic independence as well. Not only could the United States now escape the system of mercantilism, which had limited America's trade with the rest of the world, but the U.S. too could begin to develop our own industry. Britain, under the principle of mercantilism, whereby colonies ought to simply provide raw materials to the mother country and a market for manufactured goods from the mother country, the British had really discouraged the development of most industries, especially advanced industries in America, and had carefully guarded all the secrets of their industrial revolution from the rest of the world. But now, America could do the same and imitate Britain without limitations from them. Although the Industrial Revolution is predicated on an even earlier agricultural revolution, as in the 1600s and especially the early 1700s, new methods of farming were developed in Europe, especially Britain, but also the Netherlands and elsewhere too. The seed drill, pictured there, made it easier and more efficient to plant seeds. New methods of farming, other types of equipment, allowed a smaller number of farmers to produce more food more quickly and more cheaply, as again new methods and new machinery allowed one farmer to put more land under the plow. So again, this made food more available and more affordable, which would seem like a good thing, and for many people it was. For many it was not too, as fewer workers were needed to work on farms. Some farmers fired the men and women who had worked for them. Small farmers with only a very small plot of land could not necessarily afford some of the new equipment, or they did not get the same gains in efficiency and ended up selling their farms to larger landowners. And these people who no longer worked on the farms had to find other work. Some found work in towns, or in small cottage industries, the beginning of factory work. Now, a factory literally means a place where things are made by hand. To manufacture means to make by hand. Many industries had originally been based in the home, and now more and more came to be so through a system of piecework. That's clearly a picture from the late 1800s, but the principle is the same. Because in piecework, people, often women and children, although potentially these newly unemployed farm workers too, were paid to make one piece of a finished product. Those pieces in turn would be collected and taken somewhere else to assemble. So that rather than, say, a cobbler making one shoe from start to finish, you might have one person who cut the leather for the upper of the shoe, someone else to cut the leather for the sole, someone else possibly cutting all the pieces that would be nailed together for the heel. Someone would come and collect those things and take them somewhere else where they would all be assembled. This required less skill and thus also offered less pay than having a skilled craftsman do it. This was the beginning of mass production, which in turn would make lots of goods much cheaper for the consumer, but the producer would be paid less and have work that was probably less satisfying as well. And piecework and later factory work is based on the idea of division of labor, in dividing a job up into multiple separate tasks. This did allow more people to work, and again to produce a product more cheaply, but at lower pay and with less satisfaction. And this system became even more effective with the development of interchangeable parts in the early 1800s, which is often credited to Eli Whitney, also the inventor of the cotton gin, who developed a system of interchangeable parts for guns for the American military, although in fact he kind of fudged some of the early trials of the concept. But the idea was with a gun, rather than having to make each one as kind of a unique product, with a skilled gunsmith to repair or replace any broken part, you made them all identical. So that if, say, the trigger broke on one gun, you could just go to the storehouse and get an identical trigger out and stick it right in. Likewise, the lock might be completely interchangeable, or the different pieces of it. So you'd not have to make each part to fit, and you could go and get a standardized part. And as the pieces of manufactured goods became standardized, division of labor became even more efficient. Again, this was not a brand new idea, but Eli Whitney is considered the first person to have done it effectively, and originally a contract for the U.S. Army. But these small cottage industries, where things were made by hand, and either through a skilled craftsman doing what he had trained for years to do, or unskilled workers doing piecework, these cottage industries were threatened by technology too. Now, for centuries, water wheels had powered some simple machinery, particularly the grist mills that ground grain into flour or meal. But of course, these had to be where water was running. Ideally, where water ran swiftly, although you could dam up a slow-moving stream and then have water come out a chute under higher pressure. But it's still limited where you could be. But in the 1700s, this began to change. Since at least 1712, the British had used steam engines to pump out flooded coal mines, and then used that coal to power more engines. But in 1769, James Watt, an English engineer, patented a new type of steam engine that could drive other types of machinery, just as water wheels had done in the past. So these new methods of powering machines and the new machinery itself started an industrial revolution in Britain. And the first industry to really be industrialized was the textile industry. And many things, even before they were powered by water or steam, was improving the textile industry. To move quickly through them, the flying shuttle, invented in 1733, let weavers weave cloth more quickly, so quickly that spinners could not make thread quickly enough to satisfy the growing demand. But the water frame of 1762 did allow thread to be spun more quickly as water power was applied to the spinning wheels. The spinning jenny, patented 2 years later, began making thread even more quickly. And 1779, the spinning mule expanded this even further. So the British textile mills, by the late 1700s, producing the best and the cheapest cloth in the world. Again, industrial secrets they very carefully guarded. It was illegal to share the designs of textile mills with foreigners. Again, the British actively discouraged their colonies from developing these too, hoping to keep them as captive markets for their manufactured goods. And later, Britain would work hard to discourage the development of industry in Latin American countries, which also purchased British-made goods. And after much of Latin America got their independence from Spain, in many cases, those independent republics became economically colonies of the British. But in 1789, a British man named Samuel Slater, who had trained in the textile mills there, immigrated to America at the age of 21, having memorized as much as he could about the machinery he had seen in Britain before he left. He went to work for a company in Rhode Island, designed a British-style spinning and weaving factory for them, which began operation 1791. Andrew Jackson later called Samuel Slater the father of the Industrial Revolution, at least in America. Some British people called him Slater the Traitor. Of course, as American textile mills developed, we needed something to weave. And of course, wool was woven in mills, but an important innovation too would come from Eli Whitney. About a decade before, he developed his system of interchangeable parts. Although he was from Massachusetts, he visited the South, where people did not grow very much cotton. The long staple cotton that was easy to clean and spin grew in a few places along the coast, but the short staple cotton that grew well or could grow well in many parts of the South wasn't worth growing. Its short fibers were hard to spin, they were hard to clean, and Whitney realized that if it was possible to process this cotton, especially to pick out the seeds and chunks of boll and other stuff that were in the cotton, it could be very profitable. And so he developed a cotton engine, or cotton gin for short, which could clean and comb the short staple cotton 50 times as quickly as could be done by hand. Again, the cotton was basically put in a hopper, a crank was turned, and combs inside, again, picked out the seeds and bits of husk and other trash, and also lined the fibers of the cotton up all the same way, making it much easier to spin to, in processing it 50 times as quickly as you could be done by hand. But picking cotton is unpleasant. You have to lean over all day, so it hurts your lower back. The husk that contains the cotton boll is sharp. It cuts your fingers if you don't wear gloves. It cuts up your gloves if you do wear them. Plus, it's much harder to pick it effectively with gloves on. So, with the development of the cotton gin and desire to grow more cotton, the problem was that wasn't work for white people. But it was perfectly suited, at least in the view of white people, for slavery. Now, slavery had been in decline, it seemed, since the American Revolution. It was becoming in most places less profitable, and now more than ever seemed to be morally reprehensible in a country based on the idea that all men are created equal. But now that slavery was profitable again with the cotton gin, it was just too hard to give up, a necessary evil. With cheap cotton to spin and to weave, New England, and later other parts of the North, built more and more textile mills, while the South invested most of its spare money, or indebted money, in land and slaves to grow that cotton. Now, during the Napoleonic Wars, especially during Mr. Jefferson's embargo, and then during the War of 1812, American industry grew rapidly to make up for the loss of British imports. And although the British dumped cheap goods on the American market after the Treaty of Ghent was passed, America responded with a mildly protective tariff in 1816, a tariff that would grow more protective in years to come. And simply growing demand in America helped our infant industries to survive and thrive. In 1823, a group of Boston businessmen built a textile mill on the Merrimack River, a fast-flowing river not too far away, which was already the site of some early water-powered industries. In 1826, they incorporated the community as the town of Lowell, Massachusetts, named for one of their late business partners who himself had memorized industrial designs on a trip to Britain. The Lowell Mills combined spinning and weaving in a single factory, later cutting and dyeing as well, making all the major parts of the cloth-making business better coordinated and more efficient by having them under a single roof, or at least in one complex. Later, the invention of the sewing machine by Elias Howe in 1846, later improved by Isaac Singer, made sewing easier, clothing factories even more productive. Now, the owners of the Lowell Mills also built company-owned housing, perhaps creating the concept of a company town, and let them put their workers up away from their homes and families, because many of their workers were young, unmarried women, the Lowell Girls, as they were called, who were often excited to be out on their own, happy to earn their own wages. It's true they earned about half what men made for doing the same work, but their wages were under their own control. One of the few ways that a woman could really own and control her own money at that time. And while they might be working a 14-hour day, which sounds pretty rough for us, most of them were coming off the farm, and on the farm the day never ends. You work from sunrise to sunset, and when the sun goes down, you still might be called out if your sheep are giving birth, or wolves are attacking your livestock, or something like that. For a farm worker, a 14-hour day can seem like a break. And there were breaks, even if not many, during those 14-hour days. And again, when 14 hours were up, it was over. And the families of the Lowell girls appreciated their lives were closely supervised, meant to preserve their moral character. And at least at first, many of them only worked a few years in their early 20s or even late teens before getting married, taking their place in the cult of domesticity, but now bringing some money with them for their new household. Although over time, more and more spent their entire lives in the factory. And indeed, early on, the wages in the factory at Lowell were fairly good, better than those at other factories that opened later. At Lowell, at least early on, the owners did take a paternalistic approach to their employees, although probably not in reality quite as paternalistic as they claimed when describing their factory to others. But when the Panic of 1837 hit, there was a big drop in wages at Lowell and many factories, increasing resentment against the factory owners. Indeed, as economic conditions got worse and many workers felt they had nowhere to go, they began to describe themselves, especially the children who often worked in factories, as wage slaves, technically free, but really trapped by the wages they were paid. And many turned to the party of the common man to oppose their aristocratical bosses, voting Democratic in a world where propertyless men could now vote. The resentment of the working class also led to the development of early labor unions. Many were still fairly small, many still fairly weak. To some extent, they developed from the earlier craft guilds that had regulated skilled labor in the past. Some labor unions even tried to work together. In 1833, the General Trades Union was formed in New York City to try to help a number of working class people demand better treatment. All this was hard. Of course, the ultimate threat of a union is to go on strike, stop working so that the factory owners lose the supply of labor that allows them to make their product and their money. But striking was illegal in many places. Unions were often regarded as criminal conspiracies. And prior to the 1830s, workers had often gotten good enough pay they didn't really feel a need to strike, whereas in the late 1830s, many were afraid to because they so desperately needed their jobs following the Panic of 1837. So unions were pretty limited. The law was against them, the economy was against them. But they did try from time to time, and 1842 won an important case in the Massachusetts Supreme Court, the case of Commonwealth versus Hunt, Massachusetts being one of 4 states that refers to itself as a Commonwealth. And in this case, the Massachusetts Supreme Court, which usually was not particularly friendly to the working class, did rule that labor unions were not inherently criminal conspiracies, which may not sound like much. In many ways it wasn't a whole lot, but it was a starting point. They now had a legal right to exist. It did not give them much other powers or recognize, for example, a right to strike. Striking itself could still be regarded as a criminal act. But a start, small but very important. And also, despite their problems, America's working class did have a safety valve, unavailable to the working class of Europe. The ability of those unhappy with factory work to move west, settle cheap land, and start over. Now, this was certainly much harder to do than it was to say, but the fact that it was a possibility did force American factory owners to pay their workers better wages than European factory workers often got, even if not, of course, as good a wage as many American factory workers would have liked. And new technology was making it easier to settle Western land. Now, the American Midwest contains some of the most fertile soil in the world, but soil that's very thick. It would stick to the wooden or iron plows commonly used by Americans. Further west, in the Great Plains, grass had been growing for millions of years. The roots had woven together into a thick sod stretching many feet into the ground. It simply could not be cut by the early plows of Americans. But this would change in 1837 when a blacksmith from Illinois by the name of John Deere built a plow made of steel. It was a stronger, smoother, lighter plow. It stayed clean in the thick soil of the Midwest. It cut through the thick grass roots of the prairie sod and was light enough to be pulled by horses rather than oxen, allowing farmers to put more land under the plow, opening the Midwest and later the Great Plains to farming. Of course, even if you can plant more crops, that's not much good unless you can harvest them. But that was now possible too, on a larger scale. In the 1830s, Cyrus McCormick and his sons, wheat farmers in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, developed a mechanical reaper, as did another man about the same time named Obed Hussey, but it was the McCormicks who really made money at it. Mechanical reapers were pulled by horses, to begin with, eventually, of course, by steam or gasoline engines. And this was drawn through the field, and it cut down large swaths of wheat quickly, whereas previously you had to hold the wheat one handful at a time and cut it with a sickle. Later on, and these could cut wheat at 5 times the rate of men working with sickles. So you needed fewer farm workers to work the same amount of land, or could work a much larger amount of land, potentially. Later, improved threshing machines and winnowing machines made it possible to harvest or process all the wheat they had harvested. Machinery to harvest corn was later developed too. And all these inventions and other inventions and new type farming methods contributed to a new agricultural revolution, expanded the commercial farming of food crops, making food cheaper and farmers richer, although also in many cases deeper in debt, as many bought this equipment, but of course had to pay good money for it, because they could farm more land, they bought more land, but also had to borrow money to do that. And the more food they produced, the harder it was to make the same money. Rising productivity led to falling prices. This cheap food was sold to the plantations of the South, to the growing cities of the East, eventually even overseas, as different parts of the country increasingly specialized in certain economic activities. And this was possible too, to sell food produced in the Midwest to the southern plantations and the eastern factory workers, thanks to another revolution, a transportation revolution. In the 1700s, transportation in the United States was very slow. It could take weeks or even months to travel across the country. It was faster and more common to travel by water. Indeed, coastal communities in different states often had more in common with each other, culturally and economically, than coastal communities did with the backcountry towns in their own states. Roads were maintained typically by county governments. Work was done at first by local citizens who were obligated to work on the roads a certain number of days a year or else pay a fine. In general, these part-time amateur road builders weren't that good at it, and most of them didn't want to do it. Eventually, many just chose to pay their fines, and eventually that was made part of local property taxes or some other tax, and then professionals were hired to build and maintain the roads. But of course, Americans don't like paying taxes either. Those taxes were not always high enough to build the roads that a growing country needed. But in the 1790s, a private company built the Lancaster Turnpike, 62 miles of road between Philadelphia and Lancaster, Pennsylvania. A wide road with a hard surface that made money for the company that built it by charging a toll. Once the toll was paid, a barrier, called a pike, was turned back, which is why roads like this, these toll roads, were known as turnpikes. The Lancaster Turnpike was very profitable, and a turnpike boom spread across America, with many roads built over the next several decades by private companies or sometimes by states, or in many cases private companies funded by states, as state governments lent money to companies or invested in companies, some of which were very profitable, others of which barely broke even, and many of which ended up going bust, leaving investors holding worthless bonds in bankrupt companies. In many cases, it was state governments that lost their money when these companies went under, which is one thing that would lead many Americans, particularly in the South, to distrust government spending on roads and other internal improvements. Indeed, while Henry Clay hoped to build roads across the country as part of his American system, only one was built in the first half of the 1800s, at least only one major one, the National Road, also called the Cumberland Road, as Cumberland, Maryland was originally its starting point as it headed west, eventually reaching Illinois by the 1850s, but with some Americans resenting the expense, affecting the whole country, but only benefiting part of the Midwest. Still, where toll roads were built, or other roads, towns and cities boomed as if a turnpike went by. Those that were bypassed sometimes faded away. We can see much the same today with the interstate system, today and across the past 60 or 70 years. Water still remained a very important mode of transportation, though, especially after the development of better water travel, specifically steamboats. Now, some steamboats had been tested in the late 1700s, but they weren't very successful. But Robert Fulton, the great American inventor, funded by Robert Livingston, developed a steamboat they called the Clermont, named after Livingston's estate in New York. The Clermont traveled up the Hudson River in 1807, sailing 150 miles in 32 hours. Again, sailing upriver against the current, which may not seem very fast by today's standards, but in those days, especially against the current, was fast indeed. And over the next several decades, more and more steamboats were built. They could travel with or against the current, with or against the wind, making transportation across the United States much easier. They were particularly well suited to the West, where there were long, wide, deep rivers like the Ohio and the Mississippi and the Missouri. But there were not suitable rivers everywhere. But this is a scientific industrializing age. This is the 19th century. And so if there aren't rivers where we want them, we'll just build some. And so there was a canal boom in America as well, as Americans began to build canals, some funded by private companies, some by state governments. The most famous of these was the Erie Canal, built by the state of New York between 1817 and 1825 to connect the Great Lakes with the Hudson River. And of course, connecting with the Hudson River brought shipping all the way to New York Harbor and the Atlantic Ocean. The most influential sponsor of the canal was the governor of New York, DeWitt Clinton. So the canal was sometimes called, by those who thought it couldn't succeed, Clinton's Big Ditch. But it was much more than a ditch. Its construction required remarkable feats of engineering. They invented a type of concrete that would dry underwater. In places where the canal needed to flow across a valley, they built raised canals like aqueducts, known as water bridges, that carried the canal over valleys, even over other rivers. So you might be traveling down the valley and having a canal barge pass overhead. After it was completed, in a ceremony shown here with Governor Clinton pouring a cask of water from Lake Erie in New York Harbor, the cost of shipping goods from Buffalo, New York to New York City fell to 1/20th its earlier cost. And towns along canals boomed. Along the Erie Canal, for example, Rochester and Syracuse, and of course Buffalo, became major cities. But there were places that railroads could not be built. Places canals could not be built, and so we built railroads. One of the first important railroads in the U.S. was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, although here is a much later map of the B&O's route. They began construction in 1828. In 1830, trains pulled by an engine named Tom Thumb carried the first freight and passengers to travel by rail in America. Now in New York, Cornelius Vanderbilt made a fortune in ferry boats, especially once steamboats became common. He also eventually invested in railroads, making him one of the richest men in America, having a whole lot of political influence through his wealth and business connections in the United States and some other countries, particularly in Central America, where he sought to build railroads and steamboat lines as well. Indeed, he owned so many ships, he was nicknamed the Commodore. In those days, the highest rank in the U.S. Navy, because it seemed he commanded a fleet of his own. And when, late in his life, in an uncharacteristic act of generosity, he donated a lot of money to a small college in Nashville, Tennessee, Vanderbilt University named itself in his honor, and its athletic teams the Commodores. Still, people worried about this, worried that vehicles moving so fast, some went at least 16 miles an hour, could cause health problems, even insanity in humans, could frighten livestock in the country so cows would stop giving milk, even start fires with the sparks that flew from their smokestacks. And that, in fact, was true. Whether they caused insanity, probably not. But eventually railroads would cross the United States, and all the early ones were honestly pretty slow, uncomfortable, and unreliable, and with many different gauges or widths of track. So individual trains could not really go that far without having to unload their cargo or passengers onto a different train that would fit on a different railroad. It nonetheless revolutionized transportation in America. Now at sea, steamships eventually came to dominate shipping. They were more reliable than sailing ships because they don't depend on the wind. Although actually many early ships had both sails and steam power, to use whichever was more effective at the time. But in the 1840s and early 1850s, sailing ships did enjoy a last golden age, an age of clipper ships. Called that because they went so fast they could clip a lot of time off the routes that they traveled. These sailed around the world. Fastest clipper ship on record was the Sovereign of the Seas, which sailed from Honolulu to New York in 82 days in 1853. In 1854, she set a world sailing speed record that still stands, a speed of 22 knots, or 25 miles per hour. During the California Gold Rush, the Flying Cloud set a record for the fastest sailing time from New York City to San Francisco, sailing all the way around South America and back up in 89 days and 21 hours, a record that would stand for a sailing ship till 1989. But by the 1860s, clippers were being replaced by the simpler, more reliable steamboat or steamship. Now, as people could travel further, they needed to be able to communicate over greater distances, and the 19th century saw a communication revolution as well, beginning with the work of Samuel Morse, who developed a telegraph in 1837. The very earliest telegraphs could not transmit very far and weren't that effective, but they had a lot of potential. The telegraph, of course, works by transmitting electric pulses down a line. These pulses, in turn, could cause a telegraph machine to make little clicking sounds. And, of course, Morse developed his famous code of short and long clicks, dots and dashes, standing for letters and numbers and other signals. Again, early on, he had a maximum range of 2 miles, but he expanded this over time. In 1844, sent the famous message, "What hath God wrought?" from Washington, D.C. to Mount Clair, Maryland. And by 1861, telegraph lines connected the East Coast with California. As you traveled, especially along by the railway, but even down the road, telegraph lines would follow along, just as power lines and telephone lines today. And all these developments, an agricultural revolution, an industrial revolution, a transportation revolution, a communication revolution, all combined to form a market revolution, in which more and more Americans were involved in the marketplace in some way, rather than being Jeffersonian yeoman farmers. Business became increasingly important in America, especially large businesses organized as corporations rather than owned by individuals. A corporation could raise more money and limit the liability of their investors. This allowed companies to mass produce things cheaply and sell them around the country, bringing things that had once been luxuries to many more Americans, but also using new technology to limit the wages of a growing class of unskilled workers. And the country as a whole was growing richer, growing more productive. And many, although not all, individuals were growing rich alongside it, although in more and more specialized ways, as each part of the country specialized in producing one thing or another, counting on being able to trade those goods with other parts of the country. And so Americans could, in many cases, live out an American dream of working hard to achieve economic independence and prosperity.